Hi guys. In today's Economics for International Students, we're going to look at a macroeconomics question from AP Macro 2015. It's the number 3. It's a foreign exchange question, and it also includes a market for loanable funds component. So there's a couple of different aspects here we're going to look at. This is an overview of this question for students who are learning English at the same time or who want to improve their English. So the focus is really more on the vocabulary than the deeper concepts, but we will look at those ideas at the same time. All right, so you can see I've got a list of what I think is the key vocabulary in this section for economics students. We've got exchange rates, interest rates, budget deficits, the real interest rate, the short run. Here it's a noun. It can also be an adjective. Private domestic investment, plant and equipment, the yen price of the euro, reverse, here it's a verb, can be a noun, and the European Central Bank, which is often called the ECB. It's the European equivalent of the Fed, the Federal Reserve. So let's get started, and we will look at this vocabulary as we go through the question this time so that it's more obvious what the relationship is with the context. Okay, so let's get started looking at this question stem that says exchange rates and interest rates are important for macroeconomic decision making. A quick review here on exchange rates. An exchange rate is the price of one currency, one kind of money like dollars, pounds, euros, yen, and so on, in another currency. So how many euros do you get for $1? How many pounds do you get for 1 ruble or whatever? Okay. In this case, it's yen and euros we're going to be looking at. And of course, you can get a fraction of a particular currency as well, because the exchange rates will be the inverse of each other. Interest rates here are relevant because as interest rates rise, remember, an interest rate is the return you get for example, savings. So if you put money in the bank, how much in addition to your principal, your initial savings or investment, how much more do you get back? So as a percentage, that is your interest rate. If interest rates are higher in one country than in another, then you would expect investors to move money into the higher interest rate domain. So the country with the higher interest rate will see what's called a capital inflow. So that is the linkage here between exchange rates and interest rates, because if you have that capital inflow, you should expect to see the value of the currency that is being purchased rising. Because remember, to buy those assets, those investments in that country with the higher interest rate, you first need to buy their money, their currency. And by doing so, you're increasing demand. And we know from both micro and macro that if you increase demand, all else being equal, that will increase the price. And here the price is that exchange rate. Okay, so those are our first two terms, exchange rates and interest rates. Let's move on to part A. So how does an increase in Japan's government budget deficit affect each of the following? All right, so let's look at budget deficit. So a budget deficit means you are spending more than you collect in taxes. So the government is spending more, for example, on goods and services. This would be the G in your GDP calculation. Perhaps they're building more bridges, hiring more teachers, or whatever. To do this, they are borrowing money, okay? Because if you have a deficit, that means your tax revenue, the taxes you are collecting, are not sufficient. They are less than what you're spending. So the opposite of a deficit is a surplus, S-U-R-P-L-U-S. So in this case, this deficit tells us that the government is going to have to borrow money from the market for loanable funds. So this question, it never says those words. It never tells us that that is the market. They expect you to know that. So when the government goes to borrow money, they're going to borrow from the market for loanable funds. And this is going to affect the real interest rate. Okay, the real interest rate is the interest rate after it has been corrected for inflation based on some base year. Okay, that's not relevant to this question, but you would have your real interest rate on your y-axis and the quantity of loanable funds on your x-axis if you were drawing this graph. You don't have to. It just says to explain. You could, I suppose, if you wanted to, but you don't have to. The short run here, so when you see short run in an AP free response question, they're really asking about the next step, the next phase in the process, the cycle. So in this case, basically they're asking what happens next, okay, and then why, explain. So I'm just going to draw very quickly this market for loanable funds so that we can see what's going to happen to the real interest rate. So I've drawn a somewhat messy graph here of the market for loanable funds. So this is the market for all loanable funds, and drawing this graph will maybe help us to understand what happens when the government borrows money to fund its budget deficit. So this is called crowding out. Okay, it's worth noting that word here, crowding out. Okay, this is when increased borrowing by the government leads to an increase in interest rates, and that leads to a fall in investment, in private investment. Okay, so let's look at where that comes from, this crowding out phenomenon. Okay, so we can see here that we've got an increase in the budget deficit. So we're going to be borrowing money from the market for loanable funds. That means an increase in demand. So if you had to draw this, and the question does not require you to draw this, you would draw a second demand curve. I've indicated demand for loanable funds with DLF. It would shift to the right. And you can see the arrows. It's always a good idea to put arrows on your graph, even if they're messy like mine, to show the direction of change. So we see an increase from I1, the green dotted line, to the I2, the purple dotted line. That's an increase in the real interest rate. Okay, now where does that take us for the explanation? Well, that just tells us that in the short run, increased demand for funds in the market for loanable funds will lead to an increase in the real interest rate. Okay, the second part of question A, how does this affect private domestic investment in plant and equipment? So private here means businesses, companies, firms, not government. Okay. Domestic means in the country. So this would basically, when we combine this with plant and equipment here essentially means capital expenditure. So investment in things like, well, equipment. Plant could mean like a factory, tools, machinery, and so on. These would be projects that companies would undertake, they would do if the interest rate is suitably low. So if we increase the interest rate, we get this crowding out effect. Okay, and that means we get a higher interest rate that makes it more expensive for companies to borrow. So that means they need a higher rate of return on projects. So projects means things that they would invest in. So in this case, that would be all we need to say in this question is we would see a decrease in domestic investment because of this higher interest rate. And that would be all we need to say. It doesn't ask us to explain A2, so we don't have to, but we now know the reason if we didn't before. So now we've got a graph here with our yen per euro. And we've got on the x-axis the quantity of euros. I've indicated the exchange rate just with EX1. And Q, quantity 1. So supply of euros, remember this is a graph of the euros, the euro market, not the yen market. And D, euros, demand for euros. So you start out with this equilibrium here. There's no numbers, so we don't know the actual numbers. then you're going to draw a shift in the supply curve. Okay, we know that holders of euros are going to supply euros in order to buy those yen so that they can buy those assets. They can purchase those Japanese assets that have the higher interest rate. So to do this, they're going to have to first sell their euros to buy the yen. So we're going to see a shift here. We'll call this S Euro 1. Okay, and you've got a rise in the quantity, and call this just Q2. So something like this would be adequate. Dotted line. I'm going to call this EX2. So you see a fall here. So draw your arrows. An increase over here. This is the key to the question right here. This drop in the number of yen per euro. So that means we've got a depreciation of the euro. Depreciation means a fall in value compared to another currency. And remember, if one currency is depreciating, the other currency is appreciating. Appreciate here means to go up in value, to rise in value. So we see a fall here in the value of the euro. So that the explanation here would be holders of euros must supply euros to purchase yen. So that would be an increase in the supply. The second part of part B, the yen price, we see a fall in the price, the yen price of euros. Okay, so the euro falls in value relative to the yen. Okay, now if they asked you about the yen market, it would be the opposite, but that's not asked about here, so we don't need to worry about that. So to summarize question B here, they're asking us, how is the foreign exchange market for the euro going to be affected by this higher real interest rate, this domestic interest rate in Japan? We've drawn it on the graph here. We've shown that the supply of euros will increase. That's going to lead to a fall in the number of yen per euro. That's called depreciation of the euro. That means a fall in the price of the euro in terms of yen. So that answers both of those components. In a slightly differently worded question, you might see words like capital inflow. That means money, funds, investment coming into a country. Outflow is the opposite. That is when funds or investment or money leaves a country for the opposite reason. So that would be a reasonably concise answer to part B. Let's look at part C. Part C asks us, what should the European Central Bank, the ECB, do? Should it buy or sell euros in the foreign exchange market, the forex market? Okay, well, we know what happened to the yen price of the euro. We know that the euro has depreciated. It has lost value. So how can the European Central Bank respond to this if they wish to return to the original exchange rate? Okay, so they only give us two choices here. Are they going to buy euros or sell euros? So common sense from micro should remind you that purchasing an asset, anything, a good or a service, will lead to an increase in the price. Here the price is the yen price of the euro. So if we increase demand for euros, we buy euros, that is going to increase the yen price of the euro. That's called appreciation. It's going to increase the number of yen per euro. Okay. The question doesn't ask us how they could do that, but they would do that by using foreign exchange reserves. And the answer then to this question, you do not need to give an explanation. It's worth 1 mark. So you would only need to say that the ECB would buy euros. Now, if we're going to take this question any further, which is not required, you might see additional questions related to the effect of these changes on imports and exports, which are, remember, part of aggregate demand. So if we look at part B, we see the value of the euro depreciating. Well, if you're in Europe, if you're exporting, that would make your products or services more competitive. It would make them relatively cheaper in the other currency, the yen. Conversely, if you're exporting from Japan, with your appreciating yen, you are not going to be so happy. You're going to see your products become less competitive. So it really depends if you're importing or exporting. Importers like an appreciating domestic currency because it means their currency will buy more of the other currency, which will reduce the price of imports. Exporters prefer the opposite. This could be related back to your ADAS graph on a question 1 if it's AP. And you might have to draw the effect. So remembering that exports, so if we assume we have a depreciating euro relative to the yen, that's going to increase exports. And exports are part of aggregate demand. So you would see that as a shift, a movement, a shift of your aggregate demand curve to the right, an increase in real GDP, and an increase in the price level. That's not part of the question, but it very well could be on a different question. So this question here, you can see there's a few different components. We've got exchange rates, interest rates. The relationship between the two is the key to this question. Nowhere do they mention the not the foreign exchange market, sorry, the market for loanable funds, but it is integral to the question. If you don't understand that market, you probably would not be able to do the later parts of the question. So the key idea here is really crowding out, okay, which shows up in a lot of questions, both multiple choice and free response questions on AP. So that is an explanation of how you could answer this question, one way to answer this question. And those are some key terms that you might want to learn from the key vocabulary. Reverse here, just to go back and look at the vocabulary, I don't think I mentioned that word. Reverse means to return to the original position, okay? And that shows up in part C. So I hope that was useful. If you have trouble with any of this, go back and review those relevant sections of your course. Market for loanable funds, definitions like budget deficits and surpluses, real interest rates, the effect of interest rates on investment and aggregate demand, and then, of course, the last half of the question, which is related to the forex or foreign exchange markets. And like I said earlier, drawing a few of those graphs will help you to understand what's going on, and you'll be able to draw them much more quickly in the exam. So I hope that was helpful. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.